first what I'll call for a multi-perspectival theory of power. We'll say some things about power and domination, and then an alliance politics. And these are how the theoretical and political components of this vision I'm advocating come together with a multi-perspectival theory of power and a strategic theory of political alliances. The theoretical and the political components are one. When we talk about power, we are talking about, notice, not class. Class is not the problem. The problem is hierarchy. The problem is institutionalized networks of domination, where one group thinks itself superior to another group, and at first thinks this, and then it enacts this in brutal systems of domination and violence. And so racism, sexism, homophobia, speciesism, anthropocentrism, they all have something in common. They all flow from the same institutional psychological networks of hierarchy. So our problem is hierarchy. And you can look, for instance, at the Marxist argument that the domination of nature led to the domination of human beings. You can look at the anarchist argument, such as from Murray Bookchin, and say that no, the domination of humans leads to the domination of nature. It's the other way around. And you can look, for instance, at the various kinds of history we've tried to write. Theological history, humanist history, recently environmental determinist history, that we can only understand the dynamics of history from God or from human activities such as Marxists analyzed, and then from the environment, the extreme importance of how the environment has shaped human history. Right? We can believe, I think, that God is not shaping human history, we are shaping our own history. Then we begin to realize how the environment is shaping our history in incredibly powerful ways that we're only beginning to understand. But what we now need to recognize is what I'm going to call shaping history from the animal standpoint. We have to grasp what I call the animal standpoint. The animal standpoint is understanding the problems in our society, the problems in our psyche, as they flow from our relationship to animals. And when I talk about the animal standpoint, I'm not pretending as if animals can speak, although I think they're speaking to us today, as I think the earth is speaking to us today in their languages. What I mean is that we look at how the crises in our society and psychology flow from our relationship to animals, and that the domination of human over animal, over other animals, has led to the domination of human over human, and the domination of human over the earth. In other words, our relationship to animals is at the core of all these crises in the planet and in our minds. And unless we begin to resolve this, unless we address issues such as animal liberation and veganism, we don't have a chance. This is my argument, and I hope you're open-minded to hearing it. So the most decisive revolution that occurred in history, many theorists argue, was not the capitalist revolution, the industrial revolution. It began much earlier in history. It really set the framework for even that. And this revolution was the agricultural revolution. This began some 10 to 15,000 years ago. And it began to shift from living nomadic tribes or bands of human beings, hunting-gathering tribal societies. The shift from that to settled agricultural society, where we began to farm, we began to cultivate animals, we began to cultivate plants. We began, in other words, the domestication of life. We began to domesticate the planet and to domesticate animals. This shift was utterly profound and is at the core of so many problems that we have today, because I think as a result of beginning to domesticate life and using it for our purposes and pretending that we have control over the living world, we began to develop what I call the dominator worldview, that other things exist for our purposes to dominate. These other things could be the planet, it could be other species, it could be other peoples. But from the dominator worldview or standpoint, we see everything instrumentally. We see everything hierarchically. And you notice the problem with our societies. The problem with our societies is we can't understand difference without organizing as hierarchy. We can't understand difference for its own sake. We have to somehow create this in a framework where we see everything in terms of superior and inferior. This is a disease. We had a dominator worldview, and this is how it works. I'll try to describe this in very simple terms. Animals were put in what I call the moral basement. The moral basement, you have a category of beings that don't matter, that mean nothing to us in life. So once we have this category created, the moral basement, all we got to do, like with your computer, if you drag an icon into a trash bin, you just take whole categories of people and you put them down there in the moral basement. Take women, take slaves, take people of color, islanders. You take all the beings that Western European culture denigrated as inferior. There's already a preset category for this. There are already the instruments of domination for this. They came from our domination of animals. Our identity, clearly, as Homo sapiens sapiens, was formulated in distinguishing ourselves from the natural world and from other species. From realizing that they are not rational and we are rational, and we distinguish ourselves, we define ourselves as rational beings in opposition to other animals. And of course the revolution today, called cognitive ethology, is telling us that we are the non-rational beings. They have an intense sophistication to their lives and their cultures. And then in every way we try to distinguish ourselves from animals. This has proved to be false. That we know nothing yet about other animals. We're just beginning to learn. We're still in the dark ages of understanding other species, and therefore of understanding ourselves. It is just now, as we turn we make this turn in history toward utter collapse and catastrophe. Ironically, it's just now we're beginning to understand who we are. And so the conceptual framework for domination was provided by distinguishing ourselves as superior to other forms of life, and by defining the main characteristic of value as rationality. Specifically, male rationality, specifically male European rationality, was defined by opposition to our relationship to animals that began all the way back, maybe millions of years ago. We began thinking in terms of opposition and no longer just difference. So sexism and racism can easily be linked to speciesism, and we can go much further than this. We can look, for instance, at colonialism. And every time one species dominates another, there's always the vilification, the demonization of this species as an animal. They are insects, they are rats, they are mice, they are vermin, they are mere animals. And so the animal model is there. And before there's sword play, first there's word play. Before we start the killing, first we start the defining. And the defining is used from the animal model. We reduce them to animals. We take people and put them in the moral basement, and that's where we slice them apart. And there's no morality to this, because this is we have no moral obligations to animal-like people, to anyone that fits outside the standard male Western European dominator model. We slice them apart. There's absolutely no ethics to this. They're mere things. How can there be ethics to this? They're things.